The water bottle made a hollow sound when I shook it. Barely enough left to wet my cracked lips. Day 38 in the Great Sandy, and the sun hadn't even reached its cruel peak yet. I'd been rationing drops for the past week, but mathematics don't lie in the desert. 2 swallows left. Maybe 3 if I was careful. The red dirt stretched endlessly in every direction, shimmering with heat that would soon become unbearable. My shadow was still long in the morning light, pointing back toward the country I'd left behind, toward the failed marriage, the lost cattle station, the man I used to be. But shadows shrink as the day grows teeth, and I'd learned that much about the desert's rhythm. Soon there'd be nowhere to hide from what was coming. I unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers and allowed myself one precious sip. The water was warm as blood and tasted of plastic, but it was life itself sliding down my raw throat. 38 days ago, I'd walked into this wilderness carrying enough supplies for 2 weeks, and the arrogance of a man who thought he understood hardship. The desert had been teaching me about assumptions ever since. The silence out here wasn't peaceful. It was hungry. It swallowed your thoughts, your sense of time, your certainty about which direction you'd been walking. Even now, with my compass and the sun to guide me, I felt unmoored from everything I'd once known to be solid. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots against the ancient sand. I capped the bottle and tucked it back into my pack, feeling the lightness where provisions used to weigh me down. Somewhere ahead lay salvation or death, probably both looked the same from this distance. The idea had come to me 6 weeks earlier, sitting in the lawyer's office while he divided up the remnants of my life with surgical precision. Sarah got the house in town, the one we'd bought back when cattle prices were good and our marriage still had hope in it. The bank got the station, 3 generations of McKinnon's sweat and dreams carved up to satisfy debt collectors who'd never seen a drought or buried cattle in creek beds that should have been running with water. You could contest some of these terms, the lawyer had said, his voice careful and professional. But I was already gone in my head, thinking about old Tommy Ningara and the stories he used to tell around the campfire when I was a kid working the station with my grandfather. Tommy had grown up in the old ways before missions and government handouts changed everything. He'd gone walkabout as a young man, he told me, walking alone into the desert for months with nothing but a spear and the knowledge passed down from his grandfathers. Country talks to you out there, he'd said, his weathered face serious in the firelight, but only if you get quiet enough to listen. White fellas, they make too much noise up here. He'd tapped his temple with one gnarled finger. I'd been making noise up here for 43 years. The noise of ambition, of building something, of trying to hold together a marriage and a business while the world shifted beneath my feet like sand. Even the silence in my house had been loud with recrimination and unspoken blame. Sarah moving through the rooms like a ghost, both of us pretending we hadn't already given up. The night after signing the papers, I sat alone in the empty house with a bottle of whiskey and studied my grandfather's old survey maps of the region. The Great Sandy stretched north and east like a red stain across the continent, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers where a man could disappear completely, where the noise might finally stop. I wasn't fool enough to think I could live off the land like Tommy's people had done. Their knowledge had been earned over thousands of generations, passed down in ceremony and story, refined by survival into something approaching magic. But I had modern advantages: GPS, water purification tablets, emergency beacon. I could walk into that silence for 2 weeks, maybe 3, and let the desert strip away whatever was left of the man who'd failed at everything that mattered. The plan was simple enough. Drive north to Marble Bar, resupply, then head east into the heart of the Great Sandy. I'd plotted a route toward an old bore marked on the maps, 22 kilometers out, far enough to feel isolated, close enough to make it back alive. A spiritual exercise, not suicide. Though sitting in that empty house with Sarah's absence echoing in every room, the distinction felt academic. I spent 2 weeks preparing like it was a military operation. New boots broken in properly, lightweight tent tested in the backyard, water requirements calculated and recalculated. 20 liters in various containers, enough for 14 days with strict rationing, freeze-dried meals, energy bars, medical kit, solar charger for the GPS and emergency beacon. I read survival manuals and desert crossing accounts, memorized the signs of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Practiced with the emergency beacon until I could activate it blindfolded. Made lists of what could go wrong and backup plans for each scenario. But no amount of preparation could account for the variables the desert would throw at me. My neighbor Jim showed up on the final morning of preparation, wandering over with his coffee mug and that look of carefully casual concern that country people perfect. I was loading gear into the back of the Land Cruiser when he appeared beside the tailgate. "Heard you might be heading bush," he said, studying my water containers and camping equipment. "Bit of a departure from cattle work. Need some time to think." I kept arranging gear, avoiding his eyes. Jim had watched 3 families lose their properties in the past 5 years. He understood the weight that builds up in a man when everything he's worked for turns to dust. "You tell anyone where you're headed? Official-like?" His voice carried the careful tone of someone probing for reassurance without wanting to offend. I tapped the emergency beacon clipped to my belt. "Modern technology, mate. Push this button and they'll have me out of there in a few hours." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." He studied the map spread across my kitchen table through the open door. "Desert's not the same as station work, different kind of dangerous. I've been in rough country before." Which was true, but not the same thing. Chasing strayed cattle, with a vehicle and radio backup, wasn't the same as walking alone into the Great Sandy, with everything you needed strapped to your back. Jim nodded slowly, recognizing the futility of argument. When should people start worrying? The question was practical, necessary. 3 weeks. "If you haven't heard from me in 3 weeks, call the constable." But I'd already decided I didn't want anyone following me into that silence. This was between me and the desert, between the noise in my head and whatever truth might be waiting in all that emptiness. I shook Jim's hand and drove north before he could ask any more questions that might change my mind. The bitumen ran out gradually, giving way to graded dirt, then tracks that barely qualified as roads. I'd driven these remote areas before, but never with the intention of abandoning the vehicle and walking away from everything. The landscape grew more desolate with each kilometer. Red dirt and scattered scrub, breakaway country that looked like the surface of Mars. I stopped for fuel at a roadhouse where the attendant looked at my gear with practiced indifference. Men disappeared into the bush for all sorts of reasons out here. Most came back with stories. Some didn't come back at all. "Heading far?" she asked, more from habit than curiosity. "Far enough." I paid for the fuel and bought extra batteries for my torch. "You know the country out there?" She gestured vaguely toward the northeast, where the horizon shimmed with heat. "Know enough to stay out of it during the day. You picked a hell of a time for walkabout." The comment carried warning without judgment. I thanked her and drove on. I camped the last night beside the truck, 22 kilometers southeast of Marble Bar, with the headlights illuminating my final preparations. The desert was already working on me, the silence so complete I could hear my pulse in my ears. Above, the stars were thick as spilled flour, unmarked by any human light pollution. I'd forgotten how small they made you feel. I spread my sleeping bag on the ground rather than in the tent, wanting to feel the vastness pressing down. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, reminding me that the desert's dangers weren't limited to heat. Cold could kill you just as dead as dehydration, though it took longer and gave you more time to regret your choices. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of small creatures moving through the scrub. I'd hear something rustle nearby and lie perfectly still, listening to determine whether it was curious, hungry, or simply indifferent to my presence. Most desert dwellers, I knew, had better sense than to investigate strange sounds in the darkness. Morning came with that peculiar desert clarity, the air so clean and thin it seemed to magnify distances. I made coffee on my small camp stove and watched the sun rise over country that hadn't changed in thousands of years. The red rocks and scattered vegetation looked exactly as they had when the first humans walked this route, following seasonal water and game across landscapes that demanded respect. I shouldered the pack, 18 kilos with water, and checked the GPS coordinates one final time. The bore I was aiming for sat 22 kilometers northeast, a straight-line walk across reasonably flat ground. 2 days out, rest and resupply, 2 days back. Simple in theory, though the desert had ways of complicating simple plans. I locked the truck and started walking, following the compass bearing rather than looking for existing tracks. The Great Sandy wasn't technically sand dunes like the name suggested, more a vast plain of red dirt and scattered vegetation, broken by low ridges and occasional breakaway country. Hot as blazes during the day, cold enough to need a sleeping bag at night. ancient country that had been wearing down mountains when my ancestors were still figuring out agriculture. The first few hours passed in a rhythm I found surprisingly comfortable. My body settled into the weight of the pack, my breathing found its natural pace. The GPS showed steady progress toward the bore, and my water consumption was tracking slightly under the planned rate. I began to think this might be easier than I'd feared. The landscape barely changed from hour to hour, but I started noticing smaller details as my eyes adjusted to the scale. The way certain plants clustered around almost invisible drainage lines, how the color of the dirt shifted subtly with elevation changes. The different bird calls that marked morning and evening, though the middle hours belonged to silence. By midday the heat was becoming serious. I found shade beneath a desert oak and set up my small tarp for additional protection. The temperature had to be pushing 45 degrees, hot enough to cook meat on exposed rock. I sipped water sparingly and waited for the sun to lose some of its edge. This was when the silence really pressed in. No traffic, no neighbors, no background hum of civilization. Just the whisper of hot wind through spinifex grass and the occasional call of a bird hardy enough to be active in this heat. I found myself speaking aloud just to confirm my voice still worked. "Day 1, I said to the empty horizon. "Still alive, still walking." The sound was swallowed immediately by the vastness, not even an echo to keep me company. That evening I made camp beside a low ridge that offered some protection from the wind. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple that no photograph could capture. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. I pulled on my jacket and watched stars emerge one by one until the sky was thick with light. The silence at night was different, deeper, more complete. During the day, there were at least small sounds to track: insects, birds, the rustle of wind through vegetation. But after full darkness fell, the quiet became so absolute, it seemed to have physical weight. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sound of my own breathing, wondering how many people had ever experienced such complete isolation. Day 2 brought the first real test. I woke to find my water bottles covered in condensation, a good sign that meant the desert air still held some moisture. But by noon, that moisture was gone, and the heat was building towards something that felt dangerous. The GPS showed I'd covered nearly half the distance to the bore, but the landscape ahead looked increasingly hostile. The scattered vegetation was giving way to harder country, all red rock and gravel flats. The shade I'd been finding became scarcer, just isolated trees that offered minimal protection. I started walking earlier and stopping later, trying to cover ground during the marginal hours when the sun wasn't trying to kill me outright. That afternoon I climbed a low rise and thought I could see something dark on the horizon ahead, a line that might be trees around the bore. The GPS confirmed I was within 5 kilometers of the coordinates, close enough that my spirits lifted considerably. 2 weeks of walking, and I'd timed it almost perfectly. Even the water was holding out better than expected, but distances in the desert are deceptive, and what looked like a short walk stretched into hours. The dark line resolved itself into individual trees as I got closer, then into the wrong kind of trees entirely. Dead trees, their gray skeletons reaching up like arthritic fingers against the afternoon sky. The bore site, when I finally reached it, was a concrete slab surrounding a rusted pipe that disappeared into the ground. I spent an hour with the hand pump, trying different techniques, even pouring some of my precious water down the pipe to prime it. But the bore was dead, had been dead for years by the look of it. The concrete was cracked, weeds growing through the gaps. Whatever aquifer it had once tapped was either depleted or the pump mechanism had failed completely. I sat in the shade of the largest dead tree and recalculated my situation with the kind of brutal honesty the desert demands. 2 days out from the truck, maybe a day and a half if I'd pushed hard and walked through some of the heat. Water remaining. 11 liters, which sounded like plenty until you did the mathematics. In this heat, I needed at least 2 liters per day just to survive, more if I was walking hard. The smart play was obvious: turn around immediately, push hard for the truck, and hope the water held out. But something in me rebelled against the idea of cutting the journey short. I'd come here seeking answers, seeking silence, seeking something I couldn't even name. 2 days in the desert had barely scratched the surface of whatever I was looking for. I consulted the GPS and the old maps, looking for alternatives. There was another bore marked 30 kilometers further east, but it was just a mark on a 50-year-old survey map. Could be working, could be as dead as this one. There was a station homestead 40 kilometers south, but that meant admitting defeat and asking for rescue from strangers who'd want explanations I wasn't ready to give. I thought about what Tommy Ningara would have done in this situation. He would have read signs I couldn't see, found water sources that didn't appear on any map. But he'd also had knowledge passed down through generations of people who belonged to this country in ways I never would. I was an intruder here, operating on borrowed time and borrowed wisdom. The decision, when it came, felt like both surrender and defiance. I would push on to the second bore. Not because it was smart, the mathematics argued against it, but because turning back felt like admitting I'd learned nothing about who I really was underneath all the comfortable assumptions. If I was going to gamble everything on finding water in one of the most remote places on Earth, I might as well do it properly. I filled my bottles from the remaining supplies, shouldered the pack, and checked the compass bearing for the second bore. The afternoon was already building toward its daily crescendo of heat, but I had enough daylight for a few more kilometers. The dead trees fell behind me, and the Great Sandy stretched ahead like a red ocean that had never known the touch of waves. The second bore was 30 kilometers of hard walking through country that grew more desolate with each step. The scattered vegetation gave way almost entirely to rock and gravel, broken by dry creek beds that might see water once in a decade. My boots began to wear through at the heels, letting in small stones that turned each step into a minor torment. I rationed water more strictly now, allowing myself measured sips at dawn and dusk with nothing during the burning hours between. The headache started on day 5, a constant pressure behind my eyes that made the horizon shimmer with false promises. My urine turned the color of strong tea, then darker still. On day 6, I found the second bore. It was as dead as the first. I sat beside the rusted pump and did the mathematics one final time. 6 days out from the truck, 48 kilometers in a straight line, but probably 60, with all the detours around obstacles. Water remaining, 4 liters. Even if I started back immediately and walked through the heat of the day, I'd run out before I reached safety. The desert had finally stripped away all my options except one. Activate the emergency beacon and wait for rescue. I pulled the device from my pack and stared at the simple red button that would summon helicopters and search teams and explanations I wasn't ready to give, but my finger hesitated over the switch. Calling for rescue meant admitting I'd bitten off more than I could chew. It meant returning to the world of schedules and expectations and other people's opinions about what constituted reasonable behavior. Most of all, it meant cutting short a conversation with the desert that was just beginning to get interesting. I clipped the beacon back to my pack without activating it. Not from pride. The desert had been systematically destroying that for days, but from a growing certainty that whatever I'd come here to find wasn't going to reveal itself to someone who bailed out at the first sign of real difficulty. Tommy Ningara had walked into this country with nothing but traditional knowledge and the clothes on his back. I could give it at least another day. That night I dreamed of water for the first time. In the dream I was standing chest deep in a crystal-clear billabong, surrounded by paperbark trees. Fish moved like shadows in the depths below me. Birds called from hidden perches. The water was so cold it made my teeth ache, and I drank until my stomach was tight as a drum. I woke to find my sleeping bag soaked with sweat, despite the pre-dawn cold. The dream had been so vivid I could still taste the water on my tongue. But when I reached for my bottle, the few remaining drops were warm as blood and tasted of plastic fear. Day 7. Day 8. Day 9. Time began to lose meaning as I pushed deeper into the heart of the Great Sandy. I was no longer following compass bearings or checking the GPS regularly. Instead, I moved by instinct, drawn toward horizons that promised nothing but more of the same red dirt and scattered rocks. My body had entered negotiations with death, striking small bargains to extend life 1 hour at a time. I learned to move only during the marginal hours of dawn and dusk, learned to find shade where none appeared to exist. Learned to extract moisture from morning dew by wrapping my shirt around rocks and wringing out the few drops that condensed overnight. The hallucinations began on day 10. At first just movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that shifted when shadows shouldn't shift. Then sounds. The distant rumble of trucks on roads that existed only in my dehydrated brain, the murmur of conversation carried on wind that spoke no words. By day 12, I was seeing my father, dead these 15 years, walking parallel to my course about 100 meters to the south. He wore the same oil-stained work clothes he'd died in, moving with that measured pace that had characterized everything he did. When I called out to him, he'd stop and seem to listen, but never replied, never turned toward me. We walked together like that for hours, father and son separated by death and distance but somehow keeping company in the vastness. The Taina, rational part of my mind understood what was happening. Dehydration, heat stroke, the slow poisoning of a body pushed beyond its limits. But rationality was a luxury I could no longer afford. If my dying brain wanted to populate this emptiness with familiar ghosts, that was company of a sort. Day 15 brought the first serious breakdown. I'd been walking since before dawn, following what looked like an ancient track worn by generations of animals moving between water sources. The sun was approaching its brutal zenith when I simply collapsed, face first into the red sand. For several minutes, I couldn't move. My muscles had finally reached the point where conscious will no longer translated into physical action. I lay there tasting dirt and blood from where I'd bitten my tongue in the fall. Above me the sky was blue as steel and empty of everything except heat. This is where it ends, I thought. In the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing, having learned nothing except that I was exactly as foolish as everyone had always suspected. But even as I prepared to surrender, something in me refused to accept that this was the whole story. I rolled over onto my back and stared up at that merciless sky. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, the first sound I'd heard in days that wasn't produced by my own movement. The bird was invisible, but its cry seemed to come from a specific direction. Following sounds in the desert was usually a mistake, but mistakes were all I had left. It took 10 minutes to get back on my feet, another 10 to convince my legs they could still bear weight, but I managed to start walking again, following the crow's call toward whatever waited beyond the next rise. Whether it was salvation or just a more interesting place to die, I no longer much cared. The crow led me to an Aboriginal man. He appeared at the crest of a ridge perhaps 200 meters ahead, a human figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sky. Not a hallucination this time, not a trick of heat shimmer or wishful thinking, someone real, standing motionless as a surveyor's post, watching my stumbling approach. I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a whisper, lost in the desert wind before it traveled 10 feet. The figure was dark-skinned, dressed in what looked like traditional clothes, though the distance made details impossible. Aboriginal, certainly, one of the old men who still knew this country the way my grandmother had known her kitchen, by touch and instinct, and generations of accumulated wisdom. For several minutes we regarded each other across that empty space. I was too exhausted for surprise, too dehydrated for hope. He seemed to be evaluating something, weighing factors I couldn't begin to understand. Then he turned and began walking north, not hurrying but moving with the fluid economy of someone who belonged in this place. I followed. What choice did I have? He represented my only chance of survival, the only human contact I'd had in over 2 weeks. But every time I crested a hill expecting to close the distance, he'd be visible on the next ridge, maintaining that same 200 meters like we were connected by an invisible rope. This pursuit consumed what remained of my strength. Where I'd been rationing energy, parceling it out in careful increments, now I spent everything in reckless chase. I fell repeatedly, sprawling face first into sand that filled my mouth with grit. But I kept getting up and stumbling forward, driven by desperation and the primitive understanding that this was my last chance. My heart hammered against ribs that had become clearly visible beneath skin, gone papery and strange. The tunnel vision that had been narrowing for days reduced the world to just the few meters of ground directly ahead of my boots. I was navigating by sound now, the whisper of wind through spinifex, the crunch of my footsteps on ancient gravel. He led me through landscapes that seemed designed to break travelers, across knife-edge ridges where every step threatened to send me tumbling into rocky chasms. Through sand so deep it swallowed my boots to the ankle, around breakaway country where the earth had cracked open like a wound that refused to heal. The sun was setting when we reached another creek bed, this one broader than the others I'd crossed. It was lined with river-red gums that had somehow survived whatever drought had killed everything else in this forsaken place. Their shade fell across me like a benediction, but I barely noticed. The figure was gone again, vanished as if he'd never existed. I collapsed beneath the largest tree, too exhausted to curse my abandonment, too dehydrated even to cry. The bark was smooth against my back, worn by flash floods and wind into a surface like polished stone. Above me, the first stars were appearing in a sky that had turned the deep purple of expensive wine. Beautiful, I thought dimly. If I had to die somewhere, there were worse places than this grove of ancient trees beside a creek bed that remembered water. At least I'd found silence. At least, the noise in my head had finally stopped. That night I dreamed I was drowning. Water filled my lungs, cold and sweet as spring rain, while I thrashed in an ocean that stretched to every horizon. I could see the surface above me, wavering like a mirror, but every time I swam toward it, it receded further into impossible distance. In the dream, Sarah was swimming beside me, her hair fanned out like kelp, her skin pale as moonlight. She was saying something important, her mouth moving in urgent explanation, but the water muffled her words into meaningless sounds. I reached for her, and she dissolved, became foam, became memory, became the taste of salt on my lips. I dreamed of rain falling on the station, the heavy summer storms that turned dust to mud and filled the dams to overflowing. I stood naked in the downpour, arms spread wide, drinking from the sky while the land steamed around me. The house was whole again, the fences mended, cattle moving sleek and fat through grass that grew knee-high. Sarah was calling from the veranda, calling me home to a dinner that would be warm on the table, but even in the dream, I knew it was false. The rain turned to sand in my mouth, the green grass withered and died. I was back in the desert, dying beneath stars that offered light but no warmth, beauty but no salvation. I woke to find myself talking to my father again. Though he'd been dead so long, I sometimes forgot the sound of his voice. In my delirium, he sat across from me in the shade, still wearing those oil-stained coveralls, his hands black with grease that never quite washed clean. "Should have turned back at the first bore," he was saying, his voice carrying the disappointment I remembered from childhood. "Should have known better than to gamble everything on hope." "I had to try," I whispered, though speaking felt like swallowing broken glass. "Had to find something." "Find what?" "There's nothing out here but heat, and emptiness and things that want to kill you." He gestured at the wasteland surrounding us. "This isn't answers, son. This is just dying slow instead of dying quick." But even as he spoke, I could see through him to the red rocks beyond. He was just another product of my failing brain, another ghost, summoned by dehydration and despair. Still, the conversation continued through the morning hours, a dialogue between the living and the dead. We discussed my failures with the brutal honesty that only comes when there's nothing left to lose, the business decisions that had seemed so reasonable at the time, the small compromises that had eroded my marriage grain by grain, the pride that had prevented me from asking for help when help might have mattered. By noon, even the hallucinations were fading. My brain no longer had the energy to maintain them. The silence that remained was absolute, deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. No bird calls, no insect buzz, no distant rumble of civilization, just the sound of my own breathing, growing shallower with each hour. And the whisper of wind through dead grass that might have been trying to tell me something I was too far gone to understand. That's when I saw him again. The Aboriginal man, standing at the edge of my vision like a question mark against the shimmering horizon. This time he didn't lead me anywhere, didn't gesture or move. He simply stood watch, patient as the land itself, while I used the last of my strength to crawl toward whatever mercy the desert might offer. I woke to shade where there should have been none, to the sound of water where no water should exist. The Aboriginal man was gone, but beside me sat a canvas water bag, still cool to the touch. And above me stretched a lean-to of desert oak branches that someone had constructed while I lay unconscious. The shelter was crude but effective, positioned to catch the morning breeze and block the worst of the midday sun. Whoever had built it understood how to work with the desert rather than against it. The branches were arranged to channel what little wind there was, creating a microclimate several degrees cooler than the surrounding wasteland. My hand shook as I lifted the water bag. It was nearly full, the canvas damp with condensation that had no right to exist in this heat. I drank slowly, forcing myself to stop after a few mouthfuls, though every cell in my body screamed for more. The water was warm but clean, tasting faintly of eucalyptus and something else I couldn't identify. Around the shelter, I found other gifts that spoke of profound knowledge about survival in this harsh place. A handful of bush tomatoes, their red skins wrinkled but intact. What looked like bunya nuts, though we were hundreds of kilometers from where such trees grew. Several strips of dried meat wrapped in paper bark, seasoned with native herbs that made my mouth water despite my body's exhausted state. Beside these offerings lay a piece of ochre, red as dried blood, and a stick carved with symbols that meant nothing to me but somehow communicated patience. Endurance. The long view that sees beyond immediate suffering to whatever lies on the other side of testing. I spent 3 days in that shelter, rationing the water and food, with the desperation of a man who understood he'd been handed a reprieve, not a salvation. My body slowly began to remember how to function. The crushing headache faded to a manageable throb. The nausea that had been my constant companion for days finally subsided. Strength returned to my limbs like water seeping back into parched earth. On the second day I found myself strong enough to explore the immediate area around the shelter. Within 100 meters I discovered signs that spoke of recent human presence. A circle of stones arranged to reflect heat from a small fire. Marks in the sand that might have been left by someone sleeping rough. Most telling of all, a set of footprints leading away to the north, bare feet that had pressed deep into soft sand near what remained of an ancient water source. The prints were recent, made within the past few days at most. They belonged to someone who moved with purpose across terrain that would have killed me weeks ago. Someone who knew where to find water, how to construct shelter, which plants could sustain life and which would bring death. Traditional knowledge, earned over generations and passed down through ceremonies I could never hope to understand. On the third day under the lean-to, I faced the choice I'd been avoiding since waking up alive. The supplies were enough to sustain me for perhaps another week if I stayed put, longer if I moved carefully and supplemented them with whatever I could forage. But moving where? The mysterious figure had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving no trail I could follow. The deeper desert stretched endlessly northward, promising nothing but more heat, more emptiness, more tests I wasn't sure I could pass even with help. And I had no guarantee that help would come again. I thought of the Aboriginal elders, who had once undertaken these journeys as rites of passage. Walking into the wilderness to seek visions, to commune with ancestors, to find the kind of truth that only came through absolute surrender to the land. But they had possessed knowledge I lacked, which plants could sustain life, where water might be found, how to read the subtle signs that distinguished one stretch of desert from another. They had been part of this place in ways that no amount of walking could make me. I was an intruder here, kept alive by grace and the generosity of someone who owed me nothing. The desert had already given me what I'd come seeking, even if I didn't yet fully understand what that was. The decision, when it came, felt like both surrender and acceptance. I would turn back. Not because I was a coward, the past weeks had proven otherwise, but because the desert had already stripped away everything I thought I needed, and shown me what remained. The mysterious help, whether human or something that transcended such categories, had been offered not to encourage me deeper into the wasteland. It had given me the strength necessary for return, for carrying whatever insights I'd gained back into the world where they might actually matter. I spent my final night under the shelter watching stars wheel overhead, listening to the profound silence that had become as familiar as breathing. In the morning, I carefully dismantled the lean-to, arranging the branches in a neat pile weighted down with stones. I left the piece of ochre beside them, along with my wedding ring, not as payment for help received, but as acknowledgement that the man who had worn it no longer existed. The walk back began before dawn, my steps following the same route that had brought me to this place, but covering ground that now seemed alien despite its familiarity. The landmarks I remembered appeared strange when approached from the opposite direction. The distinctive rock formation that had marked my passage east now looked like something entirely different from the west. A grove of ghost gums that had provided welcome shade became an ominous cluster of skeletal sentinels. It was as if the desert had rearranged itself while I slept, transforming into new configurations that challenged every assumption about direction and distance. But I'd learned to trust the compass over my eyes, to follow bearings rather than landmarks. The GPS, when I bothered to check it, confirmed I was retracing my earlier path, even when my senses insisted otherwise. The water and food lasted 6 days, carefully rationed, supplemented by morning dew collected on my shirt and whatever moisture I could extract from the few succulents I encountered. But it was the knowledge of reliable water ahead that sustained me most, the certainty that every step carried me closer to the bore that marked the desert's edge. Closer to the truck I'd left beside a greater track that now seemed as distant and improbable as civilization on Mars. My body had learned lessons during the outward journey that served me well on the return. I walked in the pre-dawn darkness and late evening, resting through the worst heat. I knew how to find shade where none appeared to exist, how to distinguish between mirages and the real shimmer of heat rising from stone. Most importantly, I had learned to move with patience rather than desperation, to trust that forward progress would eventually deliver me to safety. But the return journey tested me in new ways. My body, already pushed beyond reasonable limits, began to fail in ways that hadn't manifested during the outward walk. Muscles that had carried me this far started to cramp and seize without warning. My vision blurred unpredictably, forcing me to stop and rest when I could ill afford the delay. Worst of all, my mind began to play tricks that were different from the earlier hallucinations. Instead of seeing people who weren't there, I found myself doubting the reality of things that were. The compass needle seemed to waver when I knew it should be steady. The GPS readings appeared to change when I wasn't looking directly at the screen. Even my own footprints in soft sand sometimes looked like they'd been made by someone else. On the fourth day of the return journey, I found myself talking aloud to fill the oppressive silence. Not to hallucinated figures this time, but conducting conversations with people from my former life. Explaining to them why I'd needed to make this journey, justifying decisions that had led to the loss of everything I'd once considered important. I told Sarah about the sunrise I'd witnessed from beneath the mysterious lean-to, how the light had painted the rocks in shades of gold and crimson she would have loved. I explained to my father why I'd had to push deeper into the desert instead of turning back at the first dry bore. How sometimes a man had to risk everything to discover what he was truly made of underneath all the comfortable lies. These conversations felt more real than the hallucinations of earlier days. Less like symptoms of dehydration and more like necessary dialogue with parts of myself I'd been avoiding for years. I found myself laughing at remembered jokes, crying over losses I'd never properly grieved. Slowly beginning to understand what the desert had been trying to teach me about the difference between solitude and loneliness. The landscape began to change subtly as I retraced my path toward the margins of human settlement. The red sand gave way to harder packed earth that held boot prints and showed signs of occasional vehicle passage. Sparse vegetation became marginally less sparse. The morning bird calls I'd forgotten slowly returned to the soundscape, tentative at first, then growing more confident as life reasserted its presence. On the seventh day, with my water exhausted and my strength failing again, I caught the scent of moisture in the air. Not the false promise of mirages but the real smell of water standing in concrete and steel. The bore that had marked my entry into the deeper desert materialized through the heat haze like a prayer answered. Its windmill turning lazily in the afternoon breeze, its tank full and sweet with artesian water that had sustained generations of stockmen and travelers before me. I drank until my stomach ached, then filled every container I possessed and drank again. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe I might actually survive this journey, that the truck waiting somewhere ahead might still start. That roads might still lead back to towns where people lived ordinary lives, insulated from the kind of elemental testing I'd subjected myself to. But even as hope returned, I found myself reluctant to leave the bore, to take the final steps that would carry me out of the desert and back into the world of schedules and expectations and other people's opinions about reasonable behavior. The silence and space that had nearly killed me had also revealed something essential about who I was when stripped of every external validation. I spent 2 days at the bore, partly to recover physically but mostly to prepare mentally for re-entry into human society. The desert had taught me to exist without constant stimulation, to find whatever strength and purpose I possessed in the conversation between myself and the land. The thought of returning to noise, traffic, television, the endless chatter that filled every silence, felt almost as threatening as the prospect of dying alone under the open sky. The truck started on the third try, its engine turning over with mechanical reliability that seemed miraculous after weeks of trusting nothing but my own 2 feet. The drive to the nearest town took 4 hours, following graded tracks and stock routes that connected this empty country to the margins of human settlement. Every kilometer brought new signs of civilization, fence lines, cattle tracks, the occasional shed or windmill that marked the boundary between wilderness and merely remote country. I arrived in Marble Bar, looking like something that had crawled out of the earth itself. Sunburned beyond recognition, 30 pounds lighter than when I'd started, wearing clothes that had been reduced to little more than suggestions of their former selves. The woman behind the counter at the roadhouse took one look at me and reached for the phone, probably to call the police or an ambulance or both. "I'm all right," I told her, though my voice came out as a croak that contradicted every word. "Just need to clean up, get some food." She studied me with the practiced eye of someone who had seen her share of men pushed to their limits by the Outback's unforgiving demands. Her expression showed concern mixed with the kind of professional wariness that came from dealing with people in various states of crisis. "You're the bloke went missing 6 weeks ago," she said after a moment. "Had people looking for you." The idea that anyone had bothered to search felt strange, almost intrusive. The desert had taught me to exist without external validation, to find whatever strength and purpose I possessed in sources that had nothing to do with other people's concerns. The thought of helicopters and search parties violating that sacred solitude seemed wrong somehow, though I recognized the irrationality of such feelings. "Didn't mean to worry anyone," I said. "Was something I needed to do." She nodded as if this made perfect sense, which in this country it probably did. Men disappeared into the bush for all sorts of reasons out here. Most came back changed in ways that couldn't be easily explained to people who'd never pushed themselves beyond the comfortable boundaries of ordinary existence. "Showers out back," she said, already reaching for ingredients to make me something to eat. "I'll call off the search, let them know you're alive. You'll want to talk to the constable too, but that can wait until you've had a feed." The shower was the first luxury I'd experienced in almost 2 months. Hot water cascading over skin that had forgotten what clean felt like. Soap that actually produced lather instead of just redistributing dirt. A mirror that showed me a face I barely recognized, hollow-cheeked, dark-skinned from weeks under the desert sun, marked by lines that hadn't existed when this journey began. But the eyes were familiar. They held something I hadn't seen in years, a certainty that had nothing to do with success or failure, profit or loss, other people's approval or disapproval. The desert had burned away everything non-essential and left behind something that felt more fundamentally true than any identity I'd ever constructed from external circumstances. The constable found me at the roadhouse 2 hours later, after I'd emerged from the shower and consumed enough food to remind my stomach what its original function was supposed to be. Constable Davies was a weathered man who looked like he'd spent his own share of time under the outback sun. He didn't ask the questions I'd expected. No demands for explanations or accusations about wasting resources on search efforts. Instead, he sat across from me with a cup of tea and waited with the patience of someone who understood that some stories couldn't be rushed. 47 days, he said eventually. It wasn't a question, something like that, lost track toward the end. Family's been worried sick. Ex-wife called twice a week, asking if we'd found anything. The information hit me sideways. Sarah, who'd walked away from our marriage with such finality, had been checking on my welfare. The desert had taught me to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them immediately, so I filed this knowledge away alongside everything else I'd need to process in the months ahead. Started as something I needed to figure out, I said. Ended as something else entirely. Davies nodded with the expression of someone who'd heard similar stories before. "You planning to file any kind of report? Officially, you were a missing person." I thought about how to compress the experience into language that would fit on forms and reports. The mysterious figure who'd appeared when death seemed certain. The water that had materialized where no water should exist. The visions that had shown me truths I couldn't have accessed through any conventional means. None of it belonged in official documentation. "Got turned around, rationed poorly, nearly died of exposure," I said. "Made it to an old station bore and found transport back." The facts were accurate if incomplete. "Don't reckon there's much more worth putting on paper." He studied me with the expression of someone who'd heard plenty of half-truths and knew when not to push for the rest. "Fair enough. You'll want to let people know you're alive though. World doesn't stop turning just because a man needs to walk into the desert for a while." The phone calls I made from the roadhouse felt like communicating across vast distances, not just geographical, but temporal. The voices of people I'd known in my previous life seemed to come from a different era entirely. Sarah answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Jesus, Michael, what the hell were you thinking?" Her voice carried relief, mixed with an anger I recognized as born from fear rather than genuine rage. "I wasn't thinking much toward the end," I said, which was both true and not the answer she wanted. Had some things to work through. 47 days without a word to anyone. Do you have any idea what that does to people who care about you? The question revealed something I hadn't expected, that despite our divorce, despite the way I'd failed as a husband and partner, she still carried concern for my well-being. The desert had stripped away my ability to take such things for granted or dismiss them as mere obligation. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it in ways that encompassed more than just the recent worry. Didn't set out to hurt anyone. Was trying to figure out how to stop doing that, actually. Her silence stretched across the phone line, filled with the weight of our shared history. The recognition that whatever had driven me into the desert wasn't something that could be resolved through conversation or compromise. It had required a more fundamental reckoning with who I was underneath all the roles I'd tried to play. "Are you okay?" she asked finally. "I mean, really okay?" I looked out the roadhouse window at the red dirt and scattered scrub, at the vastness that stretched toward horizons that still seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. The question required honesty I wasn't sure I could articulate to someone who hadn't experienced what I'd experienced. "Different," I said. "Whether that's okay or not, I guess time will tell." The conversation with my brother was shorter and more practical. He'd been managing what remained of my affairs, fielding calls from creditors and lawyers who'd assumed my disappearance was an attempt to avoid financial responsibilities. The station was gone, sold to cover debts, but there were still details that required attention. "You planning to stick around this time, or should I keep handling everything?" His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been cleaning up my messes for months without thanks or explanation. "I'll handle it," I said. "Appreciate what you've done, but it's my responsibility." "Yeah, well, responsibility's never been your strong suit." The words held truth without malice. "What's the plan now?" That was the question that mattered, wasn't it? The desert had burned away who I'd been but hadn't provided a clear blueprint for who I was supposed to become. I had no property, minimal resources, and a reputation that would make finding conventional employment difficult. But I also had something I'd never possessed before, a bone-deep understanding of what I could survive and what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. "Figure that out as I go," I said, "but figure it out honestly this time." I spent 5 days in Marble Bar, partly to recover physically, but mostly to adjust to the shock of human contact, after so much solitude. Conversations with strangers at the pub revealed that my story had taken on elements of local legend during my absence. Some claimed I'd been spotted walking with Aboriginal spirits. Others insisted I'd been kept alive by ancestors protecting someone who'd shown proper respect for the old ways. The speculation made me uncomfortable, but I began to understand it served a purpose beyond entertainment. In a landscape that regularly killed the unprepared and unwary, stories of miraculous survival became part of how people made sense of their relationship with the land. My experience, whatever its true nature, had become woven into that ongoing narrative of testing and survival that defined life in the remote country. On my last evening in town, an old Aboriginal man approached me outside the roadhouse. I'd seen him watching from a distance over the past few days, but hadn't expected direct contact. His presence carried the kind of quiet authority that came from deep knowledge of country and custom. "You the one walked out of the Sandy alone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." He studied me with eyes that seemed to catalogue details invisible to most observers, the way I held myself perhaps, or some subtle change in how I moved through space. "Someone helped you out there." The statement carried certainty that made denial pointless. Something did, yeah. Country looks after people sometimes, when they're ready to listen. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "Don't mean it'll do it again, but don't mean it won't either. What you gonna do with what you learned?" It was the question I'd been avoiding since emerging from the desert. The experience had been transformative, but transformation without application was just another form of self-indulgence. I'd spent enough years taking without giving back. "Still working that out," I said. He nodded with what might have been approval. "Good answer. Man knows everything already. He's got no business walking into the desert in the first place." That night, lying on a proper bed for the first time in almost 2 months, I found sleep elusive. The ceiling felt oppressively low after weeks under open sky, and the absence of stars visible through a window left me disoriented. But more than physical discomfort, I was grappling with the weight of return. The knowledge that insights gained in isolation would have to prove their worth in the complexity of human society. The desert had shown me who I was when stripped of all external definitions and supports. It had revealed depths of resilience I'd never suspected, and spiritual hunger I'd spent years trying to fill with material accumulation. The figure I'd followed across the sand, whether human, vision, or something that transcended such categories, had led me to water when I most needed it. And to understanding that felt more valuable than anything I'd ever owned. But understanding, like water in the desert, was only useful if it could be applied to the challenges ahead. I left Marble Bar on a bus heading south, carrying everything I owned in a small bag purchased from the roadhouse. The view from the window showed the same red earth and scattered vegetation I'd crossed on foot, but from the air-conditioned comfort of public transport, it looked almost benign. I knew better now. The desert's beauty and brutality existed simultaneously, and respecting one without acknowledging the other was a mistake that could prove fatal. The land that had nearly killed me had also saved me in ways I was still learning to understand. It had stripped away everything I thought I needed and revealed what actually mattered underneath all the comfortable assumptions. In Perth, I found a small room in a boarding house and began the slow process of rebuilding a life from nothing. The work was manual labor at first, construction sites and loading docks that valued strong backs over complicated histories. The physical demands felt manageable after what I'd endured in the desert, and the simplicity of earning wages through honest effort provided its own satisfaction. Evenings, I walked, not the desperate driven walking of my desert crossing, but steady movement through suburban streets and urban parks. The habit kept my body accustomed to covering ground on foot, while giving me time to process what I'd experienced. It attracted curious looks from neighbors who couldn't understand why anyone would choose to walk when buses and cars were available. But walking had become essential to how I processed the world, the rhythm of footsteps, the changing landscape, the conversation between movement and thought. The desert had taught me that some insights only came through the physical act of crossing difficult ground. Months passed. I paid my debts gradually, lived simply, and saved what I could. The story of my desert crossing faded from local conversation, replaced by newer dramas and concerns. But occasionally someone would recognize my name or face and ask about the experience. These conversations taught me to distill the essential elements while keeping the more mysterious aspects to myself. The importance of preparation, the danger of overconfidence, the value of help accepted with gratitude. Some experiences, I learned, lost their power when subjected to too much analysis. A year later, I received a letter forwarded through several addresses. It was from a university researcher studying traditional Aboriginal walkabouts and their modern equivalents. She'd heard about my experience and wanted to interview me for her work. The request forced me to confront how much of what happened remained beyond my ability to explain or categorize. I wrote back declining the interview but wishing her well in her research. The desert had given me what I needed when I was ready to receive it. Trying to reduce that gift to academic terminology felt like a form of betrayal. Some knowledge belonged to experience, rather than explanation. 2 years after my return, I had enough saved to make a choice about my future. I could have returned to something resembling my previous life, found investors, started another business, chased the comfortable illusions of success and security. Instead, I bought a reliable 4-wheel drive and began guiding tourists on camping trips through the safer portions of the Outback. The work felt like a way of honoring what I'd received, while giving back to the country that had taught me so much. I was careful with my clients, thorough in preparation, conservative in route selection, always carrying more water than seemed necessary. I shared practical knowledge about desert survival and respect for the land's power. But I kept the deeper mysteries to myself. The tourists wanted adventure stories and Instagram moments. What they got instead was education about reading weather patterns, finding shade, conserving water. The unglamorous skills that meant the difference between coming home with good stories and not coming home at all. Some of them understood that they were receiving something more valuable than entertainment. Sometimes, leading groups across red sand under endless sky, I remembered the figure I'd followed toward salvation. Whether it had been human, spirit, or the desert's own way of testing and teaching, it had led me to exactly what I needed when I needed it most. That kind of grace couldn't be summoned or demanded. It could only be recognized and received with gratitude when it appeared. The desert had taken everything I thought I was, and given back something truer and more durable. It had shown me that the longest roads often led through the most challenging terrain. That sometimes the only way forward required walking alone into silence, until you found what you didn't know you were seeking. In quiet moments, usually just before dawn when the horizon was beginning to separate earth from sky, I still felt the pull of that deeper silence. The desert was always there, patient and unforgiving and generous, ready to teach anyone willing to walk far enough from comfort to learn what it had to offer. 3 years after my return, I met a woman at a bush camping workshop I was running outside Kalgoorlie. Emma was a teacher from Melbourne, looking for adventure during her school holidays. Unlike most of my clients, she was more interested in the silence than the stories. More focused on learning the skills than collecting experiences to share on social media. "Why do you do this?" she asked on the second night, after the other participants had gone to sleep. We were sitting beside a small campfire, watching stars emerge in the unpolluted sky above the goldfields. It was a question I'd been asked many times, but something in her tone suggested she was looking for more than the standard answer about loving the outdoors. "Someone helped me once when I needed it most," I said. "This feels like paying that forward." She nodded as if this made perfect sense. "What kind of help?" I found myself telling her about the desert crossing, something I rarely discussed in detail with strangers. About the failed marriage and lost station, the decision to walk into the Great Sandy alone. The dry bores, the hallucinations, the mysterious figure who'd led me to water and shelter when death seemed certain. She listened without interrupting, without asking for details that would reduce the experience to entertainment. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "You don't know who it was. Never saw him clearly enough to be sure. Could have been one of the traditional owners, someone who still knew the old ways." I poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up toward the stars. "Could have been something else entirely. Does it matter?" The question surprised me with its directness. I thought about it for a long moment. Used to think it did. Spent months trying to work out the logistics. How someone could have known where I was. How they could have survived out there themselves. Where the water came from. The fire settled, flames dancing lower. Finally realized I was asking the wrong questions. What are the right questions? Emma's voice held genuine curiosity, rather than casual interest. What did I learn? How did it change me? What am I supposed to do with what I was given? I looked up at the Southern Cross, the same stars that had watched over me during those desperate nights in the desert. The who and how, that's not really my business. Emma and I kept in touch after that workshop, email at first, then phone calls, eventually visits when our schedules aligned. She understood why I'd needed to walk into the desert alone, and more importantly, she understood why I'd chosen to build a different kind of life afterward. We married 2 years later, in a simple ceremony at a station homestead near Broken Hill. No big celebration, just family and a few close friends gathered under open sky to witness promises that felt as solid as the ancient rocks surrounding us. The reception was a barbecue followed by stories around a campfire that burned until dawn. Emma gave up teaching in Melbourne and joined me in the guiding business. She brought skills I lacked, patience with difficult clients, an eye for photography that helped people capture memories without missing the actual experience. Together we developed programs that went beyond adventure tourism, into something closer to education about living thoughtfully in difficult country. 5 years after my desert crossing, we bought a small property on the edge of the Great Western Woodlands. Not a grand station like the one I'd lost, but enough land to run a few cattle and serve as a base for our guiding operations. The house was modest but comfortable, with a wide veranda that faced west towards sunsets, that painted the sky in colors no camera could capture. Sometimes, sitting on that veranda in the evening with Emma beside me and the day's work done, I thought about the man who'd walked into the desert 7 years earlier, desperate, broken, convinced he had nothing left to lose. He'd been wrong about that last part. There was always more to lose, right up until the moment when loss itself became a form of liberation. The desert had taught me that emptiness and fullness were sometimes the same thing. That silence could be more nourishing than conversation. That the longest journey was often the one that brought you back to where you belonged, but with new eyes, to see what had been there all along. I never saw the Aboriginal man again, though I made several trips back into the Great Sandy over the years. Partly for work, guiding experienced bushwalkers who wanted to test themselves against serious country. partly for my own purposes, maintaining the relationship with silence and space that had become essential to who I was. Each time, I left small offerings at places that felt significant. Not payment for past help, but acknowledgement of the ongoing gift of being able to return safely to the people and places that mattered. The desert accepted these tokens without comment, as patient and generous as always with those who approached it with proper respect. 10 years after my walkabout, a film crew approached me about making a documentary about surviving alone in extreme conditions. They wanted to recreate parts of the journey, interview experts about desert survival, turn the experience into entertainment for people who would never risk anything more dangerous than a traffic jam. I declined as politely as possible. Some stories I'd learned were meant to be lived rather than performed. The desert had given me exactly what I needed when I was ready to receive it. Trying to package that gift for mass consumption felt like a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in me. Instead, Emma and I continued the work that felt meaningful. Teaching people to read country, to move through difficult terrain safely,